Hello everyone, we are on chapter 9 and we are on paragraph 4, so I'm going to get started. Only if by means of unprejudiced observation one has wrestled through to the recognition of this truth of the intuitive essence of thinking will one succeed in clearing the way for an insight into the psychophysical organization of man. One will see that this organization can have no effect on the essential nature of thinking. At first sight, this seems to be contradicted by patently obvious facts. For ordinary experience, human thinking makes its appearance only in connection with and by means of this organization. This form of its appearance comes so much to the fore that its real significance cannot be grasped unless we recognize that in the essence of thinking, this organization plays no part whatsoever. Once we appreciate this, we can no longer fail to notice what a peculiar kind of relationship there is behind the human organization and the thinking itself. For this organization contributes nothing to the essential nature of thinking, but recedes whenever the activity of thinking makes its appearance. It suspends its own activity, it yields ground, and on the ground thus left empty, the thinking appears. The essence which is active in thinking has a twofold function. First, it represses the activity of the human organization. Secondly, it steps into its place. For even the former, the repression of the physical organization, is a consequence of the activity of thinking, and more particularly of that part of this activity which prepares the manifestation of thinking. From this one can see in what sense thinking finds its counterpart in the physical organization. When we see this, we can no longer misjudge the significance of this counterpart of the activity of thinking. When we walk over soft ground, our feet leave impressions in the soil. We shall not be tempted to say that these footprints have been formed from below by the forces of the ground. We shall not attribute to these forces any share in the production of the footprints. Just as little, if we observe the essential nature of thinking without prejudice, shall we attribute any share in that nature to the traces in the physical organism which arises through the fact that the thinking prepares its manifestation by means of the body. And paragraph 4 is summarized as follows. Our physical nature has no effect on the essential nature of thinking. The essence which is active in thinking has a twofold function. One, it represses the activity of the human organization, and two, it steps into its place. That is, through this repression, it allows itself to manifest or appear. This is a very long paragraph, but for Steiner, basically what he's saying in this paragraph is that the essential nature of thinking is that the human organization has no effect on it. As the title of the book suggests, I mean, for Steiner, intuitive thinking is a spiritual activity, and so that is why for him he says in the beginning of this paragraph, only if by means of unprejudiced observation one has wrestled through to the recognition of this truth of the intuitive essence of thinking will one succeed in clearing the way for an insight into the psychophysical organization of man. And so basically Steiner wants us to really think about this whole process of thinking, and for him it is a spiritual activity and it doesn't rely on the body. Obviously one of the questions that comes up is, why do we have a body? He does discuss this further on, but he wants us to recognize in this paragraph that the essence of thinking is not influenced by the body. And he mentions in the middle of the paragraph that the essence of thinking has a twofold nature, which is, first of all, it represses the activity of the human organization, and then secondly, it steps into its place. He gives an imagination, which I think is also useful in helping us to grasp what intuitive thinking is. And he says when we walk on soft ground, like say we're walking on mud, and our foot steps on the ground and it leaves an impression, For him, Steiner, that is an example, and that's a good imagination to try and understand what he's saying, because thinking is like, our spiritual activity of thinking is like the foot making its impression on the body. And so we can't say that because this imprint that we have is a result of the body, because that's not true. It's coming from here. We can't say, oh, because now this is gone, we can't say that it happened here. It's because this is pressing down on it. And so that's sort of an imagination he's giving it, because it might appear that this impression that is left when we walk is coming from the ground, but it's not. In reality, it's coming from the foot, which is sort of equivalent to our spiritual activity. So that's the main point in that paragraph. So I'm going to move on to paragraph 5. An important question, however, emerges here. If the human organization has no part in the essential nature of thinking, what is the significance of this organization within the whole nature of man? Now, what happens in this organization through the thinking has indeed nothing to do with the essence of thinking, but it has a great deal to do with the arising of the ego consciousness out of this thinking. Thinking, in its own essential nature, certainly contains the real I or ego, but it does not contain the ego consciousness. To see this, we have but to observe thinking with an open mind. The I is to be found within the thinking. The ego consciousness arises through the traces which the activity of thinking engraves upon our general consciousness, in the sense explained above. The ego consciousness thus arises through the bodily organization. However, this must not be taken to imply that the ego consciousness, once it has arisen, remains dependent on the bodily organization. Once arisen, it is taken up into thinking and shares henceforth in thinking's spiritual being. And the summary for 5 is, an important question arises. What is the significance of the physical organization within man? Thinking contains the real I, but it does not contain the ego consciousness, which arises through and is dependent upon the bodily organization. The ego consciousness can be taken up into thinking and shares in thinking's spiritual being. He doesn't define what ego consciousness is, but what I understand ego consciousness is that ego consciousness contains thinking, feeling, willing, our temperament, it's our personality. So for Steiner, he says in this paragraph that thinking in its essential nature contains the I, the real I, but it does not contain the ego consciousness. So that's basically in the beginning of this paragraph, he asks, why do we even need this human organization if it plays no role in the essential nature of thinking? But I mean, we have that because our human organization is home to our ego consciousness. It's home to our personality, and so that's why we have a human body, a human organization. So we can't just, dismiss that. That's sort of the role that it plays. So at the end of the paragraph, he says that the ego consciousness arises through the bodily organization, but it must not be taken to imply that this ego consciousness, once it has arisen, remains dependent on the bodily organization. And once arisen, it is taken up into thinking and shares henceforth in thinking's spiritual being. So our ego consciousness can rise from this level of materiality, being stuck in this body, and can rise up to that level of the spirit, and that attains that level through thinking. So the ego consciousness is striving towards the real I, and that is what he means by that paragraph. So that's all we're going to cover for today. So if you have any questions or comments, just send a message. Have a good day.